Welcome. In this deep dive, we're examining a fascinating intersection: Qatar's foreign policy, U.S. diplomatic views, and the role of the media network, Al Jazeera.
And our lens for this is quite specific, isn't it? We're looking at materials from WikiLeaks' global intelligence files.
Exactly. Over 5 million emails from Stratfor, the global intelligence company. These emails cover roughly mid-2004 to late 2011.
Right. Stratfor providing intelligence to corporations, government agencies. So these aren't just random emails. They're professional assessments, supposedly.
Precisely. And we're focusing on one particular email, though the date is listed as January 1st, 1970, which is clearly a placeholder or error in the data.
A known issue with some file metadata.
Yeah.
But the subject line is key.
Yes. Qatar's WikiLeaks. Qatar using Al Jazeera as diplomatic tool in Mideast. Critically, it references a U.S. diplomatic cable from November 2009.
Cable that the Guardian newspaper later obtained and published. So we have the Stratfor analysis linking to an actual U.S. government document.
That's the core. And the central claim, right out of the gate, is that Qatar uses its state-funded network, Al Jazeera,
As a tool. A diplomatic tool. Specifically within the Middle East.
which of course directly challenges the network's own narrative of editorial independence.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental tension we need to unpack here, looking at what these specific documents allege.
Okay, let's dig into that Stratfor email and the cable it cites. What's the main conclusion Stratfor drew?
Well, based on that November 2009 U.S. cable, Stratfor concluded that Al Jazeera's Arabic channel is likely to remain an instrument of Qatari influence.
An instrument of influence and also an expression of its foreign policy.
Yes, exactly. Whether that's through direct orders or just a natural alignment, the outcome described is that the channel reflects Qatar's strategic goals in the region.
Which naturally makes you wonder about the relationship between state funding and editorial direction.
Absolutely. Now, the 2009 cable itself, the primary source here, gets even more specific about how Al Jazeera might be used. It suggested the network could function as a, quote, bargaining tool.
A bargaining tool? In what sense?
In diplomatic negotiations. The idea was that Qatar could potentially moderate Al Jazeera's coverage, maybe tone it down, to help repair relationships with other countries.
Including the United States, especially if relations were strained because of Al Jazeera's reporting.
Precisely. So the implication is that the coverage isn't fixed. It could be adjusted as a diplomatic lever.
And did the U.S. diplomats writing these cables seem to believe this was the case? What kind of language did they use?
Well, the Stratfor email specifically points out that the cable referred to the political masters of Al Jazeera.
Political masters. That's quite a charged term.
It is. It strongly suggests that, from the perspective of those U.S. diplomats, the ultimate control didn't lie with the journalists or editors, but with Qatar's political leadership.
So a clear belief in top-down influence, at least within those diplomatic circles.
That's certainly the impression given by that specific phrasing highlighted in the Stratfor analysis.
Now, the cables didn't just talk about Al Jazeera's international role, did they? There was mention of the domestic situation in Qatar, too.
Right. The U.S. Embassy in Doha apparently filed a report back in June 2009.
And what did that report say?
It essentially pointed out a kind of double standard. It noted that while Qatar often championed press freedom elsewhere,
It didn't necessarily tolerate the same level of freedom within its own borders.
exactly, which adds another layer of complexity when you're trying to assess Al Jazeera's claims of complete independence from the state.
Interesting. And was there any observation about how Al Jazeera actually covered the U.S. during this period?
Yes, the cables apparently noted a shift. After Barack Obama's election, U.S. diplomats observed what they described as a more positive portrayal of the U.S. on the network.
And they expected that trend to continue.
They did. The thinking seemed to be that as overall U.S.-Qatari relations improved, Al Jazeera's coverage of the U.S. would likely stay or become even more favorable.
Which again raises that question about correlation, or perhaps causation, between diplomatic ties and editorial tone.
It certainly fuels that line of inquiry. Of course, when these cables eventually leaked,
Al Jazeera had to respond, naturally.
yes, and the Stratfor email makes sure to include that. Al Jazeera put out a statement saying it is, quote, guided by the principles of a free press.
So, a direct public rebuttal to the kinds of assessments being made privately by diplomats.
A clear difference in perspective, or at least in public positioning versus private assessment.
Were there other, maybe smaller, points of friction mentioned in the U.S.-Qatar relationship within these documents?
There was a brief mention, yes. Something about Qatar's annoyance over minor infractions, immigration, customs issues by U.S. military personnel stationed there.
Okay, so day-to-day operational friction, but it sounds like that was being handled through normal diplomatic channels.
That was the indication, yes.
Really?
Not a major crisis point, but noted nonetheless.
It's probably worth reminding ourselves, just for context, why this relationship and Qatar's influence matters so much.
Absolutely essential context. You're talking about a country with the world's third largest proven natural gas reserves. That's immense economic weight.
And strategically vital, too, hosting significant U.S. military bases right there in the Middle East.
Hugely important. Plus, looking ahead from the time of these cables, they were later selected to host the 2022 FIFA World Cup, further boosting their global profile.
So, a small country geographically, but with significant economic, strategic, and, as these documents suggest, potentially media influence.
Precisely. All these factors intertwine.
Okay, so we've seen the Stratfor analysis drawing on U.S. diplomatic cables, which paints a picture of Al-Jazeera as potentially influenced by and usable for Qatari foreign policy objectives. We've seen the diplomat's private language, the observations about coverage shifts, and the contrast with domestic press freedom, and Al Jazeera's own stance defending its independence.
It's a complex picture, definitely. The leaks provide one perspective, largely the U.S. diplomatic view as interpreted by Stratfor, while the network maintains its independence publicly.
Which leads us to a final thought, really, for you, the listener, to consider. When you have state-owned or state-funded media outlets operating internationally, what does that mean for how we understand global news?
Right. How do these inherent relationships, the potential for influence suggested in documents like these, shape the news narratives we consume?
And what does it tell us about the intricate dance between nations, their strategic interests, and the media outlets associated with them?
It prompts you to think critically about the sources of information, the potential biases, and the different layers involved, the public statements, the private assessments revealed in leaks, the intelligence analysis.
Indeed. How do all these pieces, intelligence, diplomacy, leaks, media responses, fit together to form our understanding of international affairs? That's something worth reflecting on.